In this video, I'm going to talk about the life of a Flames entity model. And what I mean by that is, when does it get created? When does it get destroyed? When does Flames call the methods of the entity model? I'm not going to talk about all the methods, but I'm going to talk about most of them, the main ones that get called. And I'm going to be looking at code while I'm looking at Forge to show you which operations in Forge result in which calls to which methods. We're not even going to look at the details of the methods. Those will be covered in another video. This is just an overview of the call sequence to the methods of an entity model. So I have Forge running right now, and I have the sensors window open, and I have the user interface displayed for the EXM sensor, which is the class that we're going to be using for pretty much all of the entity model development tutorials. And again, as we've explained, almost every model that you create for Flames will be a descendant of the Flames F-Entity class. So the things that we learn about the EXM sensor are going to apply to pretty much every type of model that you'll ever develop for Flames. So there's a bit of a learning curve learning about the entity class, but once you get up on that curve, you will have learned a significant percentage of what you need to learn for any type of Flames model development. So most entity models begin their life in the user interface of Forge. So right now, I don't have anything loaded in Forge. I've just opened it up without any scenario. And I'm going to create an EXM sensor object. So in order to create the object, I first have to create a data set. So I'll create an empty data set. And I'm going to give a name to the sensor. I'm going to call it Blue Radar. And this particular sensor requires that I put in some kind of a value here. Just as an example, normally you'd put a real name of an object right here, but in this example sensor, you just have to put something. It doesn't really matter what it is. And then I hit accept. So that creates an instance of the Blue Radar model and saves it here in this window. And I get I see it listed in the window, and I get a message in the Forge status that says that a Blue Radar object named Blue Radar was created in dataset untitled. So as you know, Forge is giving you constant feedback on all the things that it's doing right here in the Forge status window. So it's always a good idea to have the status window open. So let's talk about what happened behind the scenes when I hit the accept button. While I'm typing, Forge is doing all the work on that user interface. It's unusual that there'll be any interaction with the entity model itself unless there's some custom user interface things that do require the involvement of the class. But most of the time, Forge is doing everything here. Nothing really happens until I hit the accept button. So when I hit the accept button, the first thing Forge does is it creates a brand new instance of this particular class. So we'll go over here and look at the code. So I've got our Visual Studio project open, and I'm in the tutorial project, and I'm down here at the EXM sensor class, and the create method is in the base source code file. So let's go down here to the create method, and typically we arrange the methods or the member functions in a file in alphabetical order, and that applies to all the files that we have here and all the classes that you'll get out of the Flames repository. So create will be down here alphabetically. So this create method gets called. We'll talk about that in more detail later. So after Forge creates so it calls this returns a new instance of the object. So Forge has a pointer to the object. The next thing Forge does is it calls the object, and it allows the object to retrieve its inputs, the input values off of the screen. So it will call the retrieve method for the object. So the retrieve method is in the user interface file. So that's right here. So it calls retrieve. We'll talk about this in a later video. So then I have a instance of the object. Now Forge has an instance of the object. And right after that, it calls the configure method. So the configure method is here and also in the base file. So I'll scroll back to the base file and we'll go up here to configure. And configure is a method that allows your class to check the input values and see if it likes them. And if it doesn't like them, it can return error. If it's just not right, it might return warning, and we'll talk more about that. So configure gets called. If configure returns success, Forge will then take that new object and it will add it to its list of objects. In this case, it's the sensor manager that is managing all the sensor objects, and it will add that object to its list. Now, this is a good time to talk about managers for each primary class underneath entity. So we've got all these comm device classes. We've got a couple of different attribute classes, cognition models. So let's go back and look at the Flames class hierarchy. So you can see here, as we've looked at before, that nearly all Flames modeling classes are descendant of F-entity. And these are what we would call the primary F-entity classes. Airspace, or the C++ equivalent of that. And remember, the red ones are the C++ abstract classes that get inherited by C++ models. The blue are classes that you inherit directly if you were writing the class in C. So these are all the primary classes: airspace, formation, cognition, all the way down. And if you look at the Forge parameters menu, the menu pretty much follows that same class hierarchy. So in the class hierarchy here, there is an entity manager that's an object in Forge and in Fire, just in Flames in general, that is responsible for managing the instances or the objects that belong to each one of these primary classes. So there's an airspace manager, an atmosphere manager, a formation manager, signature matter manager, comm device manager, etc. So the sensor manager is the one that's doing all this work, creating, calling configure, calling retrieve. So we now have our object. Let's create another one. Let's just call this one blue ground radar. And we have two objects now. And let me go in for the ground radar, and I'll change the values around just a little bit so that we can see something different. So as I click here, you'll see that the values are changing. So what's happening? What makes those values change? So once an entity object has been created and it's listed by the manager, it'll just sit there and not get used until some other type of operation occurs. So one of the operations that can occur is it gets selected out of the list. So I click on it. That calls the display method. So that is another method in the user interface file. That's this guy right here. So this method gets called. So that displays the parameter values on the user interface for the object. If I should decide that I want to delete one of these objects, I'll call remove, and Forge will confirm that I really want to do it. And when that happens, back to the base methods file, the destructor method for the object will get called. So here's the destructor. So that'll get called. So that's the basic life of a entity in the sensor manager window, in an entity manager window. But there's more. There are more things that Flames will do with an entity object. So we want to talk now about this concept of a meta object. So these objects right here, as you know from the Flames user tutorials, the Forge user tutorial, these objects are what are referred to as meta objects. So they are objects that exist. They're real instances of the respective class. They're in the manager, but they will never actually be executed because they have to first be attached to a unit in order to be able to execute them. And we've talked about that in other tutorials. So I'm going to go create a unit, and I'm going to attach this object. Oh, wait a minute. Before I do that, let's talk about something else. So we're still going to talk about meta objects. Let's take this data set and let's save it. And since I haven't given it a name yet, Forge is going to ask me for the name. So I'm going to put in just test as the name of the data set, and I'm going to save it. And what happens is when the save operation is invoked from an entity manager window, the entity manager will go over all of the objects that it's managing, and it will invoke the write method for each of those objects. So the write method is in the IO file. So here's the write method. So we have a read in here, we have a write. So it just writes the method, writes the class out to the Flames, the object out to the Flames database. So that's when the write method gets called. If I drop the data set, the sensor manager will destroy all the objects in the memory version of all the objects. So that will again call the destructor. So if I go now and I load a data set, Forge will call the create method for the object. Well, Forge first opens up the data set. It starts reading through the data set. When it finds information on this particular class in the data set, it will call the create method just like it did when the accept button was called. And then it will call the read method. So that is also in the UI, in the IO file. So here's the read method. We'll talk about that in a different video. So the read method gets called, and that gets done for all the objects in the data set. So if I had lots of different objects in the data set, I would read all of those things, and then if there was another data set, I'd go read that. And that happens when I'm loading a scenario. You've noticed that when you load a scenario, we get lots of data sets that get loaded from a typical scenario. And this operation is happening for every one of them. The manager associated with that data set is looking in the data set, it's seeing it sees information on a given object with a given class. It invokes an instance of that class. It calls the read method for that class. Then it goes to the next object that's in the data set until it finishes reading the whole data set. And what Forge does is when it reads a data set, it reads the entire data set before it does anything else. And if you're loading a scenario, we'll read all the data sets before we do anything else. And the next thing that happens is the configure method. It gets called. So after the entire data set is loaded, in fact, I've neglected to mention something after the accept button. Anytime any change is made, and we've talked about this before in the user tutorial, anytime any change is made, anytime an accept button is pressed, anytime a data set is loaded, an entity is dropped, anything that happens after that operation is finished, the entire Flame scenario gets configured, which means that all of the objects that are in this data set that I just loaded will get configured. So the configure method will get called. So create gets called, the read gets called to read the object, the instance of the object gets saved in the sensor manager, and then after the change, whatever change was taking place is completed, Forge will go and call the configure method for all the loaded objects, all the loaded meta objects in particular. So that's when configure will get called again. Now, what I forgot to mention is that when I do an accept button here and I configure this guy, or I accept this guy, the configure method will get called again. So it gets called first, right after I make a change to the object, right after I hit accept. If that configure method returns success, as I've already mentioned, the object gets stored here, or it gets updated, and then the entire scenario gets configured, which will result in the configure method getting called again. So this configure method will get called twice, once right after I hit accept, and again after the entire scenario gets configured. So let me give you an example of how that works. If I put something in here that's invalid, so I leave that data processor name blank and I select accept, I'm going to get an error message from configure, And if I say no, I don't want this, I'm not going to accept this entity because it's wrong, Flames throws that newly created entity object away. And that's why it creates a new object and reads it and configures it before it saves it, because if that object is bad, it will just throw it away and not remember it. If I accept it and I say, yes, I will accept the changes, or in the case where I've got new values here and the configuration passes, that newly created object that configures successfully will replace the existing object. So you'll now notice here it says that the radar object is updated in the data set. It doesn't actually really update the object, creates a new one, configures it. If it configures successfully, it throws the old one away and it puts it in its list. Now what happens if I put something in here that's bad and I say accept? It will, if I say yes, I want to get it anyway, you can see that now how the configure method was called twice. It got called when I first accepted it, and then if I said yes, I want to do it, I want to accept it, it puts the new object in here, replaces it, calls configure again for the entire scenario, which will include calling configure for this object, and that same message that showed up in the window when I accepted it, it's going to show up here. So I'll do that again. No data processor specified, error configuring sensor blue radar. So I say yes, error configuring sensor blue radar, no data processor specified. So after we read a data set, we're going to get configure called for everybody. And I'll show you an example of that. Let's just save this data set. And I did a change, so it's configuring everything again. It configures everything every time I do anything. I'm going to drop the data set. There's no data now to fail, so it's not there. So I'm going to load it again. And right after I loaded it and I got that radar object back, it configures the entire scenario, and see there I've got the configuration message again. So let me fix that. Oops, I got to click on it first, and then I'll fix it. So that's the entire life of an entity object in Forge. It's the create, the configure, the display, the retrieve, the read, and the write. But Forge isn't quite done yet with this object. As you know, this is just a meta object, and as I talked about a few minutes ago, this object will never actually be executed during scenario execution. In order to have it executed, we have to put an instance of that object on a unit. And you should know how to do that by now. So I'm going to create a new unit data set. I'm going to give it a name, my SAM site. And I'm going to go over here to script, and I'm going to employ that sensor. So I click this insert button. I'm going to click sensor, so it puts it in there, and then I'm going to go to here, and it shows me all of my sensors, and I'll put a semicolon right there, and I hit accept. So just like any other entity manager window, I get a new instance of, I get this new unit being created. So what's going on behind the scenes here? So what Forge is doing when it processes this statement is it is looking at the particular primary class, sensor. It looks at the name of the radar, the sensor that's selected there, and it sees if it exists, and of course it does in this, what I just did. So it will go to that particular sensor object in its list of sensors, and it will call the clone method. So that method is also a base method, and it's in our base file for the class, and it's alphabetical, so it's down here. So here's clone. Clone will create a new instance of the sensor, and then it will copy it. Clone is being invoked for the meta object. So the object for which this method's called is the meta object. So that is this. That's that meta object, that blue sensor. I create a new instance of it, and I just copy the entire sensor, the whole thing into my new sensor and the one I just created, and then I return that new sensor. that new sensor is attached to the unit in Flames. So I've got a copy of that blue sensor. And so you can see now in the composition of the unit, there's the sensor model. So this is an actual instance of the sensor, but it's not the same one, even though it has the same name. It has the same name because it's a copy. This is actually a totally separate instance that is uniquely attached to this unit. Of course, as you know from Forge, I can double click on it. This takes me back to the sensor model, back to the sensor window, and so I can edit it. If whenever I hit accept, this particular meta object gets updated, so I see a new object right there, and then the entire scenario gets configured. So this meta object will get configured, but this unit will also get configured. And when this unit gets configured, as we've talked about in earlier videos, all the models that are attached to the unit get destroyed. So the destructor method will get called for this instance of the sensor that's attached to the unit. So there's another place where the destructor gets called. Then we'll go and process the script for the unit, and any model that's employed in the script will get recloned, so the clone method will get called again. So every single time I hit the accept button for a meta object that's attached to a unit, create gets called, retrieve gets called, configure gets called. If we like it, it gets put here. Then the entire scenario gets reconfigured, which means that the objects attached to all the units all get destroyed, so the destructor method gets called, and then all the objects that are referenced in the employee statements all have their clone method called. So your particular class methods quite a few of them get called every single time an accept button is pressed. And remember that even if I am accepting and making a change to a different meta object, your object is still going to get called. Your configure method is not going to get called as a part of the create and accept part, but because the entire scenario is being reconfigured, all the runtime objects attached to units are all going to get destroyed. All of the meta objects in the entire scenario are going to get configured, not in that order. They'll get configured first, and then the unit will get configured, so it'll get destroyed. Well, actually, I take that back. We destroy everything off a unit first, and then we go and we configure all the meta objects, and then we recreate. So the clone method will get called. So every time anything is changed in the scenario, your destroy method is getting called, and your clone method is getting called if you have any objects that are attached to a unit. So that's the basic flow of the base methods and the IO methods and the UI methods of an entity model class. That describes all the things that Forge is doing with all entity models. And that concludes the overview of the life of an entity model. So thanks for watching, and as always, thank you for using Flames.